He could fly. He could stop bullets. He could make the world believe a man was truly invincible. But behind Superman's perfect image in 1978, the lives of the people who brought that legend to life were far more fragile and far more human. Christopher Reeve didn't just play Superman. He became a symbol of strength the world would hold on to for decades, especially after his real life took a turn no one could have imagined. Who was your first Superman? And what did you feel the moment you saw him take flight for the first time? Released in 1978, Superman wasn't just another movie. It changed how audiences saw superheroes forever, grounding fantasy in something real, emotional, and believable. And at the center of it all was a relatively unknown actor, about to become a global icon overnight. Margot Kidder didn't just play Lois Lane. She redefined her. Fast-talking, fearless, always one step ahead, her performance brought a kind of electricity that made Superman feel human. She wasn't just the love interest. She was the equal, the spark, the voice that grounded the fantasy in something real. On screen, she moved with confidence, humor, and an almost reckless courage. But off-screen, her life told a very different story. After the success of Superman, Margot Kidder's career never followed a predictable path. There were strong roles, certainly, but also long stretches of uncertainty. And behind that, she faced deeply personal struggles, including battles with mental health that at times became public in ways she never intended. In the 1990s, a widely reported breakdown exposed just how fragile life had become for someone audiences once saw as unstoppable. What makes her story powerful isn't the struggle itself, it's what came after. Kidder didn't disappear. She rebuilt, quietly, steadily, and with the kind of honesty that many in Hollywood avoid. She began speaking openly about mental health, becoming an advocate at a time when the conversation was far less accepted than it is today. There was no dramatic comeback headline, no single defining return, just a woman choosing to live with truth, dignity, and resilience. And in a way, that made her even more courageous than the character she once played. Because Lois Lane was fearless by design, Margot Kidder had to become fearless by necessity. By the time audiences looked back on her life, it wasn't just about the role that made her famous. It was about the strength it took to keep going when the spotlight faded and reality set in. And if her story reminds us of anything, it's that the people we remember as larger than life were often fighting battles we never saw. But not every actor from Superman carried that kind of emotional weight into their later years. Some, like Gene Hackman, approached the film very differently, treating it not as a defining identity, but simply as one chapter in a much larger story. Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor was something entirely unexpected. Calculated, theatrical, even a little playful. At a time when villains were often one-dimensional, he brought intelligence and unpredictability to the role, making Luthor feel less like a comic book character and more like a man who genuinely believed in his own superiority. But unlike many of his co-stars, Hackman never seemed interested in being tied to Superman. By the time he joined the film, he was already an established, respected actor. And when the cameras stopped rolling, he moved on just as deliberately as he had stepped in. His career continued to grow, spanning decades with performances that had nothing to do with capes or comic books. Then, something even more unexpected happened. He walked away. Not because of scandal, not because of failure, but because he chose to. Hackman quietly retired from acting in the early 2000s, stepping out of the spotlight and into a life that, by Hollywood standards, almost felt invisible. No constant interviews, no attempts to relive past glory. Instead, he turned to writing, living a far more private existence than most stars of his stature ever do. And that's what makes his story so interesting. While others struggled with identity after being part of something iconic, Hackman seemed untouched by it. He never needed Superman to define him, and perhaps that's why he was able to leave it behind so completely. In a world where fame often holds on tightly, Gene Hackman simply let go. And that quiet control creates a different kind of legacy. One not built on reinvention or recovery, but on knowing exactly when to step away. But long before Hackman chose to leave, there was someone in the cast who had already spent a lifetime learning how to survive the industry, adapting, evolving, and enduring in ways that few ever manage. Jackie Cooper's Perry White may not have worn a cape, but he represented something just as important: the steady voice of authority, the man who kept everything grounded while chaos unfolded around him. His performance carried a sense of authenticity that felt earned, because it was. Cooper wasn't new to Hollywood. In fact, he had been part of it almost his entire life. Starting as a child actor in the 1930s, he experienced fame at an age when most people are still figuring out who they are. And like many child stars, the transition into adulthood could have ended everything. For some, it did. But not for Jackie Cooper. Instead of fading away, he adapted. He moved behind the camera, worked in television, directed, produced, quietly building a second life in the industry that didn't rely on being in front of it. By the time Superman came along, he wasn't chasing relevance. He already had something more valuable: longevity. That's what makes his presence in the film feel different. He wasn't becoming something new. He was bringing decades of experience into a role that required stability, credibility, and control. And after Superman, that pattern continued. No dramatic rises or falls, no public unraveling. Just a career that endured, steady, professional, and deeply rooted in understanding how the industry works. In a cast filled with transformation, Jackie Cooper represents something rare. Not reinvention, not escape, but survival. And as these stories begin to unfold side by side, a pattern starts to emerge. One that goes far beyond Superman itself, and into the reality of what it means to be remembered as something larger than life. There's something we rarely think about when we look back at a film like Superman. For us, it's frozen, perfect, untouched by time. Christopher Reeve is always flying. Margot Kidder is always fearless. Gene Hackman is always in control. They exist in a kind of permanent present, unchanged, unaging, almost untouchable. But for the people inside that frame, time never stopped. Careers shifted. Identities evolved. Private struggles unfolded far away from the version of them we remember. And while audiences kept returning to the same familiar images, the actors themselves had to keep moving forward, through success, uncertainty, reinvention, and sometimes quiet battles no one could see. That's the hidden weight of playing something iconic. Because when the world remembers you as perfect, there's very little room to be human. And maybe that's why some embraced the legacy, while others stepped away from it entirely. As we move deeper into this story, the tone begins to change. Because the next chapters aren't just about careers or choices. They're about identity, distance, and what it really means to live after becoming part of something the world never lets go. Terence Stamp didn't just play General Zod. He gave the character a kind of presence that felt almost philosophical, calm, controlled, and quietly intimidating. His performance wasn't loud or chaotic. It was measured, intentional. And that's what made it unforgettable. But unlike many actors who chase the spotlight, Stamp's career has always moved in a different rhythm. Before Superman, he had already built a reputation as a serious, respected actor. After it, he could have easily leaned into mainstream fame, repeating the same kind of roles that audiences already recognized him for. Instead, he stepped away, choosing projects that were often smaller, more experimental, sometimes even unexpected. There's a sense, when you look at his career, that he wasn't trying to be seen. He was trying to understand. In interviews over the years, Stamp has spoken less about fame and more about experience, about travel, personal growth, even spirituality. Acting, for him, became less about performance and more about perspective. And when he returned to more visible roles later in life, there was something different in his presence. Less urgency, more clarity. That's what makes his story stand out. While others wrestled with the weight of being remembered for one defining role, Stamp seemed to step outside of that entirely. He didn't reject it, but he didn't let it define him either. And in a film filled with larger-than-life figures, he may have been one of the few who quietly chose a life that was intentionally smaller, but perhaps more grounded. Because sometimes, the most powerful way to navigate fame is to step just far enough away from it to see it clearly. But if Terence Stamp represents distance from fame, then Marlon Brando represents the opposite. What happens when fame becomes something so massive, so overwhelming, that it almost eclipses the work itself? Marlon Brando's presence in Superman is brief, but it carries a kind of weight that few actors in history have ever commanded. As Jor-El, he doesn't just appear. He defines the tone of the entire story. Authority, wisdom, inevitability, all delivered with a stillness that only someone of his stature could bring. And yet, by the time Superman was released, Brando wasn't just an actor. He was already a legend. His influence on acting had reshaped the industry decades earlier. His performances had set new standards, and his name alone carried a kind of gravity that made every role feel bigger than it was on paper. But that level of fame comes with its own complications. Brando's approach to Superman was famously unconventional, reportedly focusing less on the traditional process and more on his own interpretation of the material. For some, it was brilliance. For others, it was distance. But either way, it reinforced something that had become part of his identity. He didn't follow the system. He existed outside of it. And in many ways, that's how his later life unfolded as well. Less predictable, more isolated, sometimes controversial, always complex. There's a certain irony in his role as Jor-El, the wise father figure sending his son toward a greater destiny. Because in real life, Brando himself seemed to move further and further away from the structures that once defined him. He remained influential, undeniably, but also increasingly distant. From Hollywood, from expectations, even from the image the public had built around him. And that's what makes his story so fascinating. He wasn't shaped by Superman. Superman was shaped, in part, by him. But when someone reaches that level of myth, the line between the person and the legend begins to blur, until it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. And as powerful as that kind of legacy can be, it also creates a distance, one that makes the next story feel even more personal. Because it's not about stepping away from fame or rising above it. It's about facing something that no role, no performance, and no legend could ever prepare you for. Christopher Reeve wasn't supposed to become Superman. When he was cast in 1978, He was largely unknown, tall, classically trained, but not yet a star. And maybe that's exactly why it worked. There was no ego in the performance, no sense of someone trying to be larger than life. Instead, Reeve gave the character something unexpected: sincerity. He made people believe, not just in the spectacle of flight or the fantasy of strength, but in the idea that goodness itself could feel real. His Superman wasn't distant or untouchable. He was kind, thoughtful, almost vulnerable beneath the power. And in doing that, Reeve didn't just define the role. He defined what a hero could be for an entire generation. Almost overnight, he became the face of something bigger than a movie. But fame like that comes with a quiet cost. For years, no matter what roles he took on, the world still saw Superman. It followed him, not aggressively but persistently. And while his career continued, there was always that underlying question: how do you move forward when you've already become something iconic? Then, in 1995, everything changed. A horseback riding accident left Christopher Reeve paralyzed from the neck down. It was the kind of moment that feels almost impossible to process, not just for him, but for the millions who had grown up watching him embody strength itself. The man who once flew across the screen now faced a reality defined by limitation, uncertainty, and unimaginable challenge. But what happened next is why his story matters so much. Reeve didn't disappear. He didn't retreat into silence or let the world remember him only for what he had lost. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He redefined what strength actually looks like. Through years of rehabilitation, public appearances, and advocacy, he became one of the most visible voices for spinal cord injury research. He spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity. Not as someone asking for sympathy, but as someone demanding progress, dignity, and hope. There was no performance in it, no script, no camera angles, no second takes. Just a man facing the hardest reality of his life and choosing, again and again, to move forward. And in a way, that made him more of a hero than he had ever been on screen. Because Superman was written to be invincible, Christopher Reeve had to find strength without that guarantee. He had to build it day by day, in moments that weren't dramatic or cinematic, but deeply human. And the world watched, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. Because what he represented now wasn't fantasy. It was resilience. By the time of his passing in 2004, the meaning of his legacy had shifted. He was still Superman, yes, but not because of what he did in 1978. Because of who he chose to be after everything changed. And maybe that's the part we carry with us the most. Because it reminds us that being a hero was never about flying. It was about enduring. When you look back at Superman today, it's easy to remember the spectacle, the music, the costume, the feeling of wonder. But behind all of that were real people, living real lives that didn't follow a script. Some found stability, some faced struggle, some stepped away. And one transformed what the role itself meant. That's the truth behind something iconic. It doesn't stay frozen in time the way we remember it. It grows, changes, and takes on new meaning as the lives connected to it unfold. Superman promised us a world where strength could overcome anything. But the people behind it showed us something even more important. That strength isn't about being untouched by hardship. It's about continuing, even when everything changes. And maybe that's why, decades later, the story still matters. Not because it made us believe a man could fly, but because it showed us what it means to stand back up, no matter how impossible that might feel. Which of these stories stayed with you the most? And when you think of Superman now, what do you see?